So thank you to all of you for showing up. Some people tell me that 90% of life is showing up. So thank you. In terms of the Recovering Systems Thinker subtitle on this presentation, by the time I get done, you'll probably have an inkling as to why I label it that way, though mostly the presentation is about trial and learning. It's about my 4.5 decades of the most meaningful insights that I recall, most of which I wish had occurred at least 4 decades earlier, because then life wouldn't have been quite so difficult. So we'll start here about, we have a problem. I'm sitting at the breakfast table in the morning, having a very pleasant breakfast, and my wife yells down from upstairs, "Are you finally going to clean up that unsightly growth around the bird feeder today? Because I'm getting tired of looking at it." And when that happens, all of a sudden, this whole series of past events flashes before my eyes as to how it was I got myself into this predicament. I deal with a lot of frustration on an ongoing basis, and a pleasant breakfast helps me deal with the frustrations. And as of late, there have been birds outside on the railing, and they've added to my pleasant breakfast, helping me deal with frustration. So after that happens for a few days, I decide, well, maybe I should go ahead and install a bird feeder, because it will increase the birds at the feeder, increase the birds outside, and help me have a more pleasant breakfast. And when I do this, it does in fact accomplish that. And it adds to the attractiveness of the garden, which attracts more birds, which increases my pleasant breakfast. And then I realized, have you looked at the price of birdseed lately, so that the birds increases the need to buy birdseed, which adds to my frustration. And the birds create spillage, which increases the need to buy birdseed, which adds to the frustration. And the bird feeder attracts the universal eating machine, which is squirrels, which decreases the birds at feeder, increases the need to buy birdseed, increases spillage, increasing the need to buy birdseed, which adds to my frustration. And if that wasn't enough, the spillage promotes the unsightly growth that my wife is complaining about, and that increases my frustration. And the spillage attracts rodents, and I have to figure out what to do about those, because then they're a pain. And as of late, the birds are now pooping all over the railing, and I have to figure out how to clean that up. So the question is, what's the real problem? And we'll sort of leave this here at the moment, and we'll come back to it after a while. This presentation is, is based on this Kumu model that I developed, and I typically unfold this model piece by piece as I present it. The difficulty that arises is every time I do that, it seems as though I want to change the order in which I present things, which is kind of difficult when you put it into slides. So I'm showing you the whole model at the moment, and we'll begin at the beginning. Well, we actually started at the end, but we'll go back to the beginning and talk about how this journey for me began. It is not my intention to attempt to convince you of anything during this presentation, simply to share my aha moments over the past 4.5 decades. So this journey began in 1975 when a professor in a computer course said, for this course, we're going to read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change. Not that I would recommend that you read the book unless you're also interested in therapy. So, because for me, what happened was, it was like they tell me taking mind-altering drugs, because all of the cosmic tumblers clicked into place and things lined up. And I became an evangelist for the systems paradigm in a manner that's indescribable. So that people used to say, what do you do? And as I began to tell them, you could see their eyes glaze over as they were asking themselves, why did I ask, and how do I get him to stop? So the difficulty was that I sort of got into this from a system dynamics perspective. You know, back in those days, we were doing models with punch cards and IBM 360s and GPSS, and it was, you know, less exciting than watching paint dry. So we learn through growing up that making mistakes is not a good thing. So we talk about trial and error all the time, and I finally got over that. But the difficulty was that given a blank page, knowing that I want to create a model, because I'm not sure where I want to start, I can't get started. So I'm in this vicious reinforcing cycle of not being able to get stuff done because I'm concerned about how do I go about doing this and not make any errors. And that's sometime along the way, I finally learned to think about trial and learning as opposed to trial and error. I think Nike's got it right, just do it. So over the years, I developed quantitative models and qualitative models and attempted to develop my expertise in system dynamics, whatever that might be. Though along the way, I came to realize that there were actually thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of models and methods that claim to embrace the systems paradigm. And if you have an extra 660 euros, you can buy the latest copy of the encyclopedia. And I was concerned, I was confused and concerned and disturbed. Well, a lot of people tell me I'm disturbed, but about why it is we got to have so many models and methods when system dynamics seems to be so sufficient. Though somebody introduced me to this model by Michael C. Jackson called System Thinking, Creative Holism for Managers. And this model gave me a way to understand why it was that multiple methods and models made sense. So that if you think about a system as being somewhere between simple, something you can think of as conceiving of and designing and building, to complex, where the best you can possibly hope for is to understand it to some extent. And the context that you might be working in, where the participants have the same goals and objectives and belief systems, and they agree on things and what they're trying to do, to pluralist, where the participants maybe have similar goals and objectives and they can come to an agreement on things, to coercive, where you have a group of stakeholders who will never agree on anything. And you probably have some of those that come to mind. So in this matrix, he presented a number of different models or different approaches that seemed to make sense in that context. So in hard systems thinking, there's systems analysis and operations research. And in dynamic systems, you end up with system dynamics and a number of methods. And that continues, so that in each one of these categories, there are different approaches that seem to provide some amount of progress in working on situations. And this was really good, because all of a sudden I understood why there were lots of different models and methods. And then very shortly I became terribly, terribly depressed, because I've struggled for years to develop some level of competence in system dynamics. And all of a sudden I realized I got to learn a half a dozen different approaches to dealing with situations. And I actually stopped and said, self, you're not this smart. What are you going to do? So the depression, fortunately, didn't last for too long. And I ended up writing the only paper that I've ever published. And that was in the newsletter, Systems Thinking newsletter that Pegasus used to publish. And it was called And it was sort of an outgrowth. I actually stopped to ask myself the question, how do I develop a model? And strangely enough, I had been developing models for a long time, but never asked myself how I go about doing it. And over time, I had done it from the inside out and the top down, the bottom up, and outside in, in every way imaginable, though over time, it seemed as though I had developed an approach for developing models, which felt very comfortable, just I never actually thought about it. I just did it on an ongoing basis. That back to what I said about Nike having the right answer, just do it. And From my own personal perspective, a model is a simplification of reality intended to promote understanding. To the extent that the model does that, it's a good model. And if it doesn't, either work on it some more or throw it away and build another one. But the sequence that I came up with was begin with a situation or topic you want to understand, ask, and what influences this? And then ask, what does this influence? And then repeat steps 2 and 3 repeatedly until you run out of answers. Then you explain it to somebody else and ask them what's missing. And then don't be an idiot and argue with them about their feedback because you ask for it. Seek to understand why they have those perspectives. And this is how I develop models. And what I actually came to understand when I did this was that all of the models and methods, regardless of what they all have exactly the same intent. The intent is to understand relationships and their implications. So I got to a point where I didn't have to argue with people about whether their methods were better than anyone else's. I don't care what your method is. Does it work? Does it get you to where you want to go? I understand you're pursuing understanding relationships and their implications, which is why I stopped being a systems thinker. I became a storyteller of relationships and their implications. I got to a point of saying, there are no things. Now, this is kind of heretical, or so people tell me. There are no things. There are simply bundles of relationships to which we have affixed labels as a matter of convenience. If I want to describe the relationship between you and your car, I'm interested in the relationship. I'm not interested in the however many relationships there are that compose all of the pieces of the car, or all of the relationships that make you what you are. I accept that and I have fixed a label to it, and I'm interested in the relationship between you and the car. So that's why I'm at a point of saying it's all about relationships and implications, because there isn't anything else. So,
hey, Gene, here's a
yes.
question. Is the
Okay.
paper available, or at least the key insights within the paper?
Yeah, it's right here. In other words, one of the links is this model. This model is done in Kumu, and all of these pieces that I'm presenting are links at the bottom of here. And in the midst of don't lose sight of this. These are absolutely phenomenal, and you know that.
Well, yes, I do.
Well, so, but it forms a marvelous crib sheet for getting you to stop and ask, are there perspectives about this situation that I'm trying to understand the relationships and their implications of that I've missed? And there are 14 habits here. And if you spend time and ponder it, they're just more explicit things about relationships and their implications. That's all it is. And you know, people, you can state it in a trivial fashion, but it's not trivial. I mean, there's this old Sufi saying about, because you understand one, you think you understand two, because 1 and 1 is 2. But first you have to understand and. And as we pursue understanding and look for answers to things, and tends to provide us with the best answers, as opposed to this or that. If we can figure, in other words, we figured out how to integrate independent and dependent to create interdependent. There are lots of things that we can't figure out how to integrate because we can't get our mind around what the integration would look like. What happens if you integrate management and leadership in an effective manner? I'm sorry, I'm getting off track here. So in part of the development of Anne, I came to a realization that there are really only three structures, no matter how complex the models were that I developed. There were only three structures in them. There was a stock independent growth or decline. There was exponential growth or goal seeking. And that's it. It's like the electron, neutron, and proton that are used to make up all of the elements in the periodic table. And the elements in the periodic table that these things make up is, in fact, the archetypes, which I call frequent, well, sometimes I call them archetypes, but mostly I call them frequently recurring structures. So that when you set out to do something, you can try to fix a problem or you can promote growth. And there's a meaningful elaboration of those starting points to say that to fix a problem, linear growth progresses over time, but slows. And then over time, there's a tendency to settle for less, or the fix overshoots the goal, or things oscillate back and forth, or the fix creates a problem elsewhere. And these are, or things get better and then worse. And then the underlying causes is not addressed. And then we get to addiction and the underlying problem gets worse. And these are simply combinations of those three basic structures that when I first ran into this, reading the biography of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, he said, there are fundamental underlying structures which operate across all branches of science. And if you learn the structures and how they operate, you can take much of your learning from one place to another. And I initially thought, well, that's pretty ludicrous. Then I realized that all of the branches of science are a fabrication of man, not nature. So why wouldn't there just be one set of structures that operate? The thing was, he wrote the paper, he conceived of general systems teaching, and he wrote it in German, and the translator made a mistake. And we ended up being stuck with general systems theory forever, which was not his intent. But so the archetypes and the belief or understanding is there are only archetypes. There are bunches of archetypes that are mashed together to confuse us. And I recycled this model from someone else because it's a real good model for storytelling that has to do with avoiding births or unwanted births and dealing with that situation, or abortions or sex education, and it unfolds really well. Though the thought was, what's it really trying to tell me? So I tried to simplify the model, and I came up with an abstract that was as complex as the one I started from, so that wasn't working. Though in the process, I had this amazing aha moment and realized that this is two shifting the burden structures mashed together. So that this part of the model has to do with accommodate births, and this part has to do with avoid births, and this part has to do with avoid pregnancy. And there's two relationships that are missed in the model. So while it's easy to talk about the fact that in any complex model, there's typically one or a very few number of structures that are responsible for the overall behavior of the set of relationships. Finding it is not the easiest thing in the world. But I still believe it, and I find it. Spending almost a year with a customer developing this amazing qualitative relationship model and turning it into a simulation and waking up one morning and saying, we just wasted a fortune because it's just a simple shifting the burden structure. They're spending all their time focusing on the symptoms and they're not addressing the underlying problem. So they're never going to get anywhere if they keep doing this. But be that as it may. Am I running out of time yet? All right. So I was feeling froggy, and I developed this systems thinking certification program, and everybody thought I was gone off the deep end. But it's here, and it's been revised, and it's something that a person could finish in a weekend, and it's based on developing models in Kumu, and it talks about perspectives in the relationships and how to use Kumu and developing a set of models to demonstrate that you understand relationships and their implications. And I initially developed this course in Udemy, and the first few people that went through it gave me these amazing reviews. So amazing, I thought I was being had. And then a couple of people went through it and they said, okay, this is awesome. Now, how do we sell systems thinking to our organization? And I had a meltdown because I knew that they missed the whole point. Though it was good that they asked, because I spent, I don't know, probably a week pondering their question, and I'll tell you what I came up with in a moment. So I developed, I'd labor over my models sometimes for days or weeks or sometimes longer. And I would send them to people because I wanted to impress them with how smart I was, not realizing that they really didn't care. And after I'd send them a model, after it made their head hurt for a while, they'd send back something like, well, that's nice. What they really wanted to say is, why'd you send this to me? I made this connection between a model and a play. If you go to a play and you sit there and you watch the relationships unfold between the actors from one act to another, at the end of the play, you leave and you take the story with you. Because as Bateson said, it's the pattern that connects. And it was really at that moment that I became a storyteller. So that instead of giving someone one of these incomprehensible wiring diagrams, I began to develop stories, just like the one that I started with at the beginning about we have a problem. And the first one I did was Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cries Wolf, which is, it's about 6 elements that unfolds in 4 loops, and it's really clear. So the idea is that who cares about systems thinking? What people really want to do is they want to understand how to deal with situations that they're wrestling with, which is about understanding the relationships and their implications. And the best way to actually communicate an understanding is to take a clear insight compressed in time, presented in a manner that allows the audience to discover it. You create an aha moment for them. Which gets back to, how do I sell systems thinking to my organization? This one you can take to the bank, because unless you can find one white crow someplace, people always do exactly what makes the most amount of sense to them based on their current understanding in the context of the moment. The implication is that if you do something that seems to make no sense to me whatsoever, it's not because of something you don't understand, it's because of something I don't understand. Because if I were you, I would be doing the same thing. Back to Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. So you couple that with a quote from Spencer Johnson in The 1 Minute Salesperson. While almost everyone loves to buy, no one likes to be sold. Think about a person wandering around a department store looking at things, and the clerk walks up and says, "May I help you?" And typically the answer is no, I'm just thinking. The reason for that is the story that goes through the person's head in about a microsecond is, how can this person be so presumptuous as to think I need help? I'm perfectly capable of helping myself. So in terms of, we've been trying to sell systems thinking for since the 30s, I think. And when you discount people, they become defensive. if I walk up to you and tell you you're an idiot, all right, I mean, we're done, okay? So, which is akin to walking up and say, really to figure out how to deal with your problem, you got to learn systems thinking. No, it's not a good approach. The first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. And the first rule of systems thinking that I adopted was don't talk about systems thinking. What I talk about, I came to believe that modeling for most people is an unnatural act. To ask people to go develop a model is, they'd rather go have a root canal. So to sit down with someone and have them describe to you what they're wrestling with and ask them, is it okay if I take notes? And the notes I take look like a model, but I don't mention the word model, and I just start scribbling notes. And after a few minutes, I begin to ask them questions based upon my notes. And it's absolutely amazing that within 15 minutes, the person is saying, you really ought to connect this to this over here, and we should add this element and connect this to this. And they're developing a model, and it's amazing. It's called the stealth approach. So, Buckminster Fuller said, trying to change people is a waste of time. You have to give them a tool that will cause them to think differently. And for those people who are investigating relationships and their implications, you are the tool. You sort of induce them to think differently without telling them to think differently. The most amazing workshop I ever did was an accident. Going to a conference to do a 4-hour workshop and forgetting that it was a workshop and having all this stuff prepared, and even I wouldn't want to listen to me for 4 hours. And at breakfast, realizing that I didn't have a workshop prepared. So while I finished my coffee, I created a workshop, and I walked into this group of 35 people and I said, take out a piece of paper. On the piece of paper, draw a dot, label it cat. A couple inches away from it, draw another dot and label it mouse. Now draw an arrow from cat to mouse and label it chasing. You've now created your first relationship model. If you feel faint, you should leave now. This group was absolutely out of control for 4 hours. And at the end of 4 hours, they were developing extremely complex relationship models and telling stories to each other about things that they were wrestling with. And nowhere in that 4 hours did we ever talk about systems thinking. All we talked about was understanding relationships and their implications. So we talked about how a savings account works. Everybody understands it, though you provide them with a different way of looking at it without actually telling them that you're giving them a different way to look at it. I once wrote this crazy article called Change Management, the Columbo Approach. Maybe some of you remember Columbo. It's always just one more thing. And he has a way of discounting himself and trying to get other people to help him understand things that he doesn't understand. Because when you ask people questions, as long as they're not difficult, annoying questions that make them feel small, you bring them towards you as opposed to telling them things and pushing you away. And I have now violated that for 25 minutes. And the last piece was, when the sage has finished his work, the people will say, we did it ourselves. So all of that culminates into what I said about tripping over the truth in moments. And I'm not going to talk about that. But if we go back to this, now the question was, what's the real problem? Anyone have a thought about what the real problem here is? The real problem is masked by all the detail. Because the real problem,
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Maybe your frustration is the real problem.
Your wife doesn't like messes.
After 50 some years, I'm not sure I want to go down that aisle. So it is. I mean, the the real problem is the frustration. So that rather than actually figuring out what it is that's causing the frustration and deal with it, all of this stuff is addressing the symptoms. This is another one of those shifting the burden problems where I'm treating the symptoms as opposed to dealing with the fundamental solution. And the side effect is the situation doesn't get better. And I find that over and over again, that we continue to develop very complex sets of relationships and we get lost in a relationship. And less is often more. Trying to get people to take pieces out of their models is unbelievably difficult because they just, when people decide they want to model them, that foul 6-letter word that begins with an S, and they have to figure out where the boundaries are. If you start with the situation and evolve outward, creating the set of relationships, the boundary ends up being at the point of relevance. I mean, you don't include things that aren't relevant, hopefully. So it's simply synthesizing that set of relationships that's meaningful to the situation, and then figuring out which pieces you can lump together so that you can actually see what's really happening amidst all of the pieces. And this
Gene,
model, go ahead.
We have a question and have for a while.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so again, as you dive into it, it might be insightful to hear her question.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay, I'm
Okay.
ready.
Okay, so Sharika, you go ahead and then ask your question, and then we have another question that I'll ask from Nicole. So go ahead, Sharika.
All right, thank you. I'll try to see if I can get this out clearly because it's not exactly clear in my mind. But I was thinking about the mental models that you were talking about, and that story that you shared of in the workshop getting people to write models themselves. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to help people make models that are not solely dependent on their own personal experience. Because while their personal experience might be true for them, it may not apply for everyone. So it may not be a model that works for everyone, if that makes sense.
Okay. And my answer to that is right here in terms of I have to admit that I have my perspective and other people have their perspective, so that when I explain the model to someone else to get their perspective, I have to make an attempt to understand their perspective, as opposed to just discount it to say, well, that's not what I wanted. That's not, all right. We have to get over ourselves, okay? Because we most of the time we're just too freaking self-centered. So I lost it, sorry.
Oh, that gave me some things to think about. Thank
Okay,
you.
okay.
Next. A next question was, can you give a title of a book that ties systems thinking and therapy? Do you happen to know one?
You referenced it earlier, Jean, at the very beginning.
I did?
I think so. I think you said
I think it was a
don't wanna read
snarky.
this book unless you want therapy or something too.
Oh, this.
Stafford Bear.
I don't recommend reading this book, okay? It is so convoluted, well, it wasn't at that point in time, okay? But it's not written to help people understand. If in terms of reading, Systems 1 by Draper Kaufman is absolutely phenomenal. The Primer by Donella Meadows, Michael C. Jackson's System Thinking Creative Holism for Managers. And this just happens to be a downloadable link, so you don't have to go spend $60 for the book. And those are the places that I recommend people to start. I mean, Kaufman's paper has been rewritten by his son and it's available on Amazon, but the original is still marvelous. And there's a sense of humor to it that makes it kind of light. And it's about 40 pages, I think. So this particular model, I said, is a Kumu model, and the link is in the chat. And when you go there, all of these items that have, when you mouse over them and there's something in blue at the bottom of them, that means that there's actually a link to something that you can go to. And in terms of the archetypes model, when you go there, every one of the elements actually takes you to an Insight Maker model that's the qualitative version and the quantitative version, and it actually runs a simulation that you can play with to give you a sense of what the pictures look like. And in terms of what I'm up to now, as one of the links that Joan talked about, a couple of years ago, I decided to retire. That was a mistake because I got terribly, terribly depressed and found out that I just couldn't stop doing this. So last October, I started writing Systems Wiki's Musings, which are short 1 to 2 page papers about some aspect of relationships and their implications that's on my mind. And I've been posting them at systemswikisubstack.com, which you can subscribe to for free. And I post 1 or 2 a week, and they'll show, if you subscribe, they'll show up in your mailbox. But there's about 65 of them at the moment.
And in response to Nicole's question about the ties of systems thinking and therapy, people have entered a few recommendations in chat. So Nicole, make sure you check what people have put into chat also. And if anybody's not familiar with saving what shows up in chat, if you use the 3 little dots down at the bottom of chat, you can save everything that shows up in chat that way.
It's only 12:40. I should have talked more. People don't have any questions.
And people can still, ask questions, unmute and ask questions. A link to the wiki, yes. So somebody just asked, is there a link to the wiki? That was one of the links that got put into chat. There were 4 links of Jean's information that got put into chat. And then Maria just reposted that one also.
And this particular model is right here.
Also, there's a question about the implementation of kind of the merging of storytelling and systems thinking. And actually, Sherry, you're quite into storytelling and systems thinking. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, or anybody here, storytelling and systems thinking?
I have a question, maybe I'd like to put, I don't know if someone has a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think in the beginning of the session, you mentioned that you tried to make a corporation where you work for to understand about system thinking, and there was a mistake. Could you elaborate that a little bit? Why was it a mistake, and what were the main challenges that you?
Okay, the course itself wasn't a mistake. People just thought I was presumptuous, as like who's this upstart that thinks that he can develop a certified systems thinker course when the System Dynamics Society and ISS and all these other people haven't been able to do it.
Mhm.
But you know, the part that caused me to melt down was when somebody said, how do I sell systems thinking to my organization? Because I knew that we've been trying to do that for 70 or 80 years with a minimal amount of progress.
Mhm.
So this I still, well, I admit I'm biased, but I still think that this is a marvelous introduction to developing relationships and their implications. Now, there are multiple environments in which one can develop relationship models.
Mhm.
And I wrote a musing, which was essentially torn between three lovers, feeling like a fool, because I spent 5 years working with Scott Fort Monroe as he was developing Insight Maker, and 3 years working with the Kumu people as they were developing Kumu. And they gave me almost every function that I asked for if I could explain the utility of it.
Mhm.
And then there's the shortcoming of Kumu is it's not real-time multi-user. Though Causality is and Sticky Studio is, though neither of them have the breadth and depth of capability that Insight that Kumu has. Though once upon a time, Kumu was relatively easy to use. And then the users asked for 1,000 options and the developers gave them all of them. So people go to Kumu to develop a relationship model and they get all distracted by all of the shiny bells and whistles and forget they were going to create a model. So I created a template which anybody can use and copy and start from there. And there are 5 short videos as part of it that explain everything that's here, so that you could take this essentially as the equivalent of this whole course, and you could do it in 5 videos in one model.
Mhm.
And this particular piece of work is where it's right here somewhere. Right here, the Kumu templates right here, along with the one that I did for Insight Maker. I just got tired of doing all the setups that I wanted to do for creating a relationship model that looked like I wanted it to look. And there have been numerous new aha moments along the way in terms of, I was a month or so ago, creating a relationship, repurposing one from somebody else. And I noticed that when I looked at it, well, there's virtuous loops and vicious loops and stabilizing and stagnating loops and all the rest of this. And I realized that when I looked at it, I couldn't tell one from the other unless I actually moused over it and figured out what it said. And I said, well, why don't I color code the labels for the loops? So there's a video down here about new loop types. And you notice that someplace this says, this is a vicious, green is this, and that says loops. They contribute their caution or their concern, which is green, yellow, or red for the labels on the loops. So just by looking at the map, I have a sense of where the critical aspect of the map might be.
I find this this way of labeling also very, very interesting. One of the modeling languages that I use also uses this type of characteristic. I use SysML mainly at work, and we also have this possibility to label the relationships between different artifacts, either traced back or derived or requested for. So yeah, that's also, I think, a common characteristic in very different modeling languages nowadays, right?
Other questions?
Yes, Jean, there are a couple about storytelling there's one from Kevin. Can you talk about the storytelling processes you use for stakeholders and facilitators? And there's one from Carolyn. Can you talk more about the types of experiences that create those aha moments, compressed in time, discovered by the audience?
Well, if I knew where to find them, I'd have found a lot more of them. So that, well, this one, well, I have to admit that while this seems to make logical sense, I can't be absolutely certain that this is exactly the way history unfolded. I mean, we think about things and we sort of put them in an order that makes sense. And I'm not sure which one actually happened before which, though I know this is where I started and this is where I am. Though in terms of the Heath brothers have written a whole series of books about fix and stitch and switch and upstream and moments, and they're all chapters in one book on change. And this is out of the Moments book. And I think it's the essence of the whole book. One doesn't need to read the book. You can go to YouTube and watch 2 or 3 of their videos. And it says you need to help people trip over the truth, so that rather than me trying to convince you of something, back to what I said is people always do exactly what makes the most amount of sense to them. You provide a basis for them having an aha moment so that something makes different sense to them based upon, oh, they discovered it. As I said, something through our interactions, the best that I could possibly hope to accomplish is to enable you to realize how smart you are. I've never had anybody argue with that.
Are there conditions that you found that are more likely to establish the interactions that will establish the trip, for people to trip over the truth?
Well, the more specific it is to their particular context, the better. As opposed to, the bird feeder model is fine and probably relates well to somebody who has experienced the same problem. Though using that model to simply as a generalization for shifting the burden, it probably points out better, or the shifting the burden is probably more meaningful to people who are actually caught in the shifting the burden scenario, which happens. So you could do this with any of the archetypes. You simply have to fabricate an approach to getting them to realize the implications of the relationships without being extremely obvious. Nicole, you're laughing. Am I that funny?
No, it's just resonating because, yeah, I mean, if you've got to get people to get it themselves, right? And they have to see like, oh, have this aha moment. And yeah, they don't want to hear the sage on the stage. And so I think where Joan was going is, what are the conditions? And I know that, with Waters Center and the way I develop curriculum and facilitate is really about that meta learning process and, getting them to learn it. I mean, it's similar to like a coaching model or a coaching philosophy, right? You don't tell them the answer, you facilitate a process that gets them to, the answer.
And Another question has come in. And we've just got like a few, like 2 minutes here, and then I have a couple of closing slides. What is your experience working with emancipatory or postmodern systems thinking? What resources would you recommend to learn more about them?
I don't have experience in that arena. Though, we go to the right place. Wrong mouse, sorry. I'm lost in my own project here. So there were two items that two approaches. One was critical system heuristics and the other one was team integrity for emancipatory, and then postmodern systems thinking, which I would have to go back and see exactly what he was talking about in the book to further understand it. So, but you know, the book is downloadable there from the model. I think I would welcome an opportunity to go get filleted in one of those environments to learn about, well, you know, you got to do it to learn something. You know, I could ponder it for a long time, but it's not like actually experiencing it. So I'm still looking at it from the perspective of trying to understand the stakeholders and their perspectives and figuring out what it is across them that has some merit. I know that when I said one of the first models I developed was the Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And somebody sent me another model, which was Aesop's fable from the wolf's perspective. Okay. And I said, oh, yes. And you could tell it from the townspeople's perspective and the boy's perspective and the sheep's perspective. And they all have an amount of validity to them, which gets us right back to the habits cards, right?
Right.
Right?
Changing perspectives, right? And in response to your answer to that question, the question came from Maria. Maria wrote back, I would welcome that opportunity too. And she says, thank you for your answer. And to echo that, thank you, Jean. I think we could all say, thank you, Jean. And thank you to all the participants also for being here for this lively interaction. Because your being here then just, you know, fed Jean to more insights and more thoughts. And that's what Jean is all about, as we've seen here. Just all the musings. And as we said, the recording then, this recording will be linked into Jean's model here. And so you'll be able to get this. Where will the model be? Will it be in your musings, Jean?
Well, this model itself, the
Mhm.
link to it has been posted in the chat twice, but
Yes, it has.
I can post it again, which
Okay.
is right here. Okay, that's the link to the model.
Mhm.
And when you provide me with the video, it will
Uh-huh.
be right here, because I've presented this 6 times now, and each one of them is slightly different. I mean, here's one that I did to the Open University in last year, 10-12, and you know, it's the
Keeps-
thoughts continue to evolve, and
keeps
I capture
reappearing.
them.
Yes.
So the current project, well, in addition to the musing, I think I started the musings as an escape from this project, which is, every time I think about working on this project, I become catatonic, like like dusting my library. because this particular project, which you can access from here, it's this model, is in one way or another access to everything that I have ever created. All right, so that here, each one of these paid elements actually leads to somewhere else. And these are all different models in this Kumu project. And here is everything I know about doing storytelling in Kumu. And here is everything I know about doing simulations in Insight Maker. And here is the essence of and, which is an approach to figuring out a set of relationships and then figuring out how to deal with it over time. And it just,
Great.
it makes my head hurt. So
We don't want to do that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay, we're 2 minutes past the hour. Thank you again so much, Jean, and thank you all for participating. Bye-bye now. Bye, everybody.